Our last speaker on this panel is named Ravi Iyer, Managing Director of the USC Marshall School's Neely Center. Ravi Ravi spent 4 years leading data science, research, and product teams across Meta toward improving the societal impact of social media. And I know Meta is a name on everybody's lips when we're talking about tech and AI, so I'm excited to hear more. Please welcome to the stage, Ravi Iyer.
All right, thanks everyone for having me. Yes, as he said, I'm Ravi. I am the Managing Director of USC Marshall School's Neely Center. And I'm gonna talk to you today a little bit about how we can design better civic conversations without judging content. I think we all, and I wanna leave you with 2 take-homes because 12-minute speech, what can you actually take home with you? Hopefully you will take these 2 things home. 1, that we can hold platforms accountable for the design choices they make, and 2, we can validate that using measures of user experience. This is probably kind of opaque now. Hopefully it'll be less opaque by the time I finish. So I think we all see discussions online of social issues. I think we all have this idea that they aren't as good as they could be. They don't appeal to our better angels. They often are sort of our worst instincts reflected online. And we have language to talk about why these things are not as good as they could be. We talk about misinformation, we talk about hate, we talk about harassment. Is that the problem? And I guess I'd like to argue that that's not necessarily the problem. These things all exist offline. What actually the problem online is not the existence of people lying or creating hate, which existed long before social media, but it's the amplification and incentivization of that kind of content. And one way to think of it is that social media doesn't really democratize speech. We talk about it democratizing. We all can express our opinions, but I personally don't express a lot of my opinions online, in part because I just don't get as much reach as I expect. It's kind of like shouting into a void. The people who get a lot of reach are the ones who are sharing each other's content in these networks, right? And we see these dark PR firms that have disinformation for hire, where they create networks of pages that all share the same content, and they get to the top of these feeds, and it's really hard to compete with that. And a lot of people, you can try to compete with that. A lot of people are also intimidated by the responses they'll get. They feel like they'll share their opinions, they'll be harassed. And so a lot of times what we see online doesn't reflect everyday people's opinions. It reflects a small group of people's opinions who often are at the extremes. The other issue that I see in terms of incentivization is around social media's tendency to incentivize more polarizing content. And I could have picked many people's quoting. I could have quoted many people about this. I picked Ben Sass's book, Them, in part because it's great to see a Republican senator calling this out. And what he talks about is how many people actually would love to escape the cycles of outrage, where they're saying more and more outrageous things to get more metrics. But when they do that, their metrics plummet, they don't get as much attention, and they find themselves throwing themselves back into that outrage loop. So social media, in some ways, the incentives of the system are towards content that people are not proud of. I don't know, many of us here probably have engaged in storytelling online. Do you ever feel this incentive to say things in a way that gets more attention as opposed to the way that you'd want to say it naturally? Maybe that incentive is not actually helpful for telling the best stories possible. So as our MC mentioned, I spent about 4.5 years before starting at the Neely Center, working at Meta across teams on these kinds of issues. I started off in data science. My job was kind of like being an accountant. I counted how many times people viewed misinformation, how many times they reported bullying and harassment. I realized we could drive those metrics very low. We still wouldn't solve the problem. And that's in part because a lot of people's definitions of what was harmful, kind of like Kurt's talk, just didn't conform to our definition, to our policy definitions. And so I joined research where I could ask people, what do you think is harmful? How does that map to our policies? We tried to close some of those policy gaps, but it didn't always work, and I'll show you some examples of why. And so the best successes we had were really more in the design of the platform. And so I ended my time there in product management, trying to work more on the core algorithms to prevent these things, these incentives from existing in the first place. And so an example I like to use, which dovetails well with the last talk, so I worked there during the George Floyd protests, and a kind of content that you would see online was what people sometimes call fear speech. And it would take the form of, there are people who are coming to your community, maybe they're part of Antifa, and so you need to show up and defend yourself against these protests. And unfortunately, some people did show up armed to defend themselves against these, the misleading claim that the protesters were all out to get them and people were killed. And the problem here is that it's hard to prove a negative, right? Like it's not, it's certainly misleading, but you can't prove that no person who had any connection to Antifa was part of any protest, right? It's hard to disprove this kind of general fear speech. And you can see it happen internationally in places like Sri Lanka. That's what the picture on the right is. And oftentimes when people look for hate speech online, they often find this fear speech is actually what is more prevalent and problematic. But the problem is that you can't really legislate what people can or cannot be afraid of, right? Like it's kind of draconian, and a lot of us probably want to tell people of things that we think legitimately they should be afraid of, right? And so, I used to show this graph internally a lot. Dangerous speech is actually about a lot more than content. This is from the Dangerous Speech Project. It says something pretty obvious that we all know, that it's not about what you say. It's often about who's saying it, who are they saying it to, the context behind it. And so, enforcement's never going to capture, policies are never going to capture all the ways that people create hate towards each other, right? And when you try, you often get things like over-enforcement. So, this is actually not from the recent Israel-Palestine, conflict, but this is actually from many years ago. And there's a BSR human rights report about, the impact on people's speech of enforcement efforts. And it was just, there's no way to be even across any conflict. Classifiers are just never going to detect hate speech equally across any language. And so you get over-enforcement, you get bias. And when people are, being attacked by another group, whether you're in Israel, whether you're in Palestine, whether you're in Ukraine, it's natural to say things about the other group. So you could say this, amazingly important thing, and then you say like one small thing that technically violates some policy, and all of a sudden your whole thing gets taken down. And so there's situations where it just really is inappropriate to be judging people's speech. So that was kind of what I learned in my time at Meta. And I'm not saying we shouldn't moderate content, but I am saying that it had limited effectiveness. It wasn't going to get us to the place we wanted to go. And so we didn't just throw up our hands and say, we can't do anything about it. There were some things that we did that I think we can at least learn from. I don't think we solved the problem, but I think, we made a dent in some parts of it, and then there are things that we can do more aggressively across platforms and at Meta to make things better. And so a lot of them go in the realm of design changes. So what are some things we did? Well, we actually changed some of the incentives for political content, where instead of optimizing for things that get lots of comments, we tried to optimize for, instead, surveys of like what is high or low quality, for example. So we actually, this is a survey of that we had in the comment space. Was this comment above high or low quality? And if I say something like, F you, politician, like that's something that I'll get lots of engagement on. And by some algorithms, that will show at the top of a comment thread. But it's not a high quality comment. It's just an engaging comment. And when you ask people what they want, they'll often tell you, they don't aspire to read more comments like that. They aspire to read, more informative comments, more connecting comments. And we would take some of those survey elements and we'd put them into the user interface. So we would ask people, like instead of assuming what people engaged with is what they want, we would ask them, what do you want to see more of? What do you want to see less of? We would put a little X in the upper right of some number of posts so that people could tell us not that things are violating a policy, but that they don't like a thing. Because people often don't know what our policies are. They don't know like what's the difference between hate and harassment and misinformation. They just know it's bad and they don't like it and they don't want to see as much of it. So putting that in there allowed us to like detect some of that content better. And then finally, another thing we did was like rate and functionality limiting. Around January 6th, it was a tiny group of people inviting people to all these Stop the Steal groups. Just ways that you can stop small groups of people from dominating a space, even though a larger group of people don't share those attitudes. And so we put all those together. Since I left Meta, I've talked to people at other platforms, talked about the practices they use to reform the incentives of these ecosystems. And I apologize for the font here. And so you look at we have a design code for social media. We were actually putting it into legislation in the state of Minnesota that we're working on. And we're talking about it internationally as well, because internationally, the problem with a lot of social media legislation is it often takes the form of like content you can or cannot say. Which is very dangerous to give to a government, that power, right? But if you talk about design, it's more content neutral. So, so our design code really has two goals. One is to empower users. We used to have this analogy we would use internally of donuts versus kale. So if you give me a plate of donuts, I will eat them, and so I will engage with donuts to some degree. But I don't aspire to eat more donuts, right? I aspire to eat healthier food. And it's the same thing in the information space. If you put some kind of content in front of me, a fight video, something obnoxious, I might engage with it, but I don't aspire to have more of that content. How can we appeal to people's aspirational choices as opposed to their, what they engage with? And if you do things like that, you give users more empowerment. There's less chances of people being able to manipulate others through like gaming engagement, and you get better outcomes for children. You get better outcomes for democracy. And so finally, how do we know that this? How would we measure if this works? So when I was at Meta, we would not ask, wouldn't just goal on, can we reduce violence incitement? We would also try to understand how we're affecting the user experience, right? And so this little blip there is users telling us, not that something has violated the violence incitement policy, but that they are seeing things online that they think could lead to violence, right? So perhaps the kind of stuff that Kurt was talking about. And recently, other people have made this observation that in like the child well-being space that bullying and harassment is only 0.08% of content, but if you survey users, 10%, 11% of users of teens say that they've been bullied and harassed in a 7-day period, right? Which is a sizable number of our youth, right? 1 in 10 kids at your school. So we've been doing that in the external world to sort of take that idea of measuring user experience. We've been working with the Center for Economic and Social Research at USC, which has this household-based probability panel, and using some of these same measures that we used internally at Meta, things like, have you seen content that you think is bad for the world? And we get predictable results where platforms like Twitter have a lot more content that people consider bad for the world, and people are having worse experiences on that platform, as opposed to a place like LinkedIn. And the goal here isn't for platforms to have zero misinformation or zero bad experiences, right? Because bad experiences are going to happen online. The goal is not to get rid of all bad experiences. But when some platforms have a lot more, an order of magnitude more bad experiences than other platforms, well then I think we have to ask ourselves, like, are those platforms designed in the best interest of society? And that's especially true because we also measure the positive side. So we also measure, like, where are people learning new things? Where are people connecting with other people? And so on a platform like LinkedIn, people are actually learning more than on a platform like Twitter, but they're experiencing a lot less of these bad for the world content, a lot less things that are affecting them negatively. And so that trade-off is just much better. And so it is possible to design a platform that can have, where the incentives are not towards this kind of salacious, misinformative content. And then finally, we are doing this in the realm of AI as well. So, unlike with social, we don't want to be surprised as people start adopting AI about the harms that people start to report. In our initial surveys, only 10% of people, despite all the rhetoric, only 10% of people had used generative AI systems in a 4-week period. In our latest survey, 18% had used it. So it's growing, but it's still not most people. It's not like social media where it's like 70% of people will use social media. A lot of people are just using it out of curiosity if you ask them why they're using it. And then if you ask them if they're harmed by it, most people don't really say they're being harmed by generative AI systems. They find them useful generally. But that's today, right? So we want to track these things over time so that if people start using these AI systems for mental health or for companionship, that we start to catch these harms ahead of time, unlike with social media, which we're sort of catching up to. So just to put a point on it, I hope I've left you with 2 takeaways. One, we can hold platforms accountable for the design choices they make, and so things like optimizing for engagement. And 2, we can validate the choices they make using measures of user experience. And then this is my contact info if anyone's interested in working on this with me. So thank you.